The screams of 11-year-old Zara Washington echoed through the airplane cabin as flight attendant Heather Donovan yanked the portable oxygen concentrator from her hands. "This device is unauthorized." 20 minutes later, the entire flight was grounded, with the pilot, co-pilot, and CEO of the airline personally apologizing to Zara's father, Dr. Malcolm Washington. Before we dive into this incredible story of discrimination and a father's fight for justice, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from today. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories of everyday people standing up against injustice and coming out on top. Now let's find out how an ordinary flight turned into a battle for a young girl's dignity and life. Zara Washington had been battling cystic fibrosis since she was diagnosed at age 4. The genetic disorder that causes persistent lung infections and limits the ability to breathe over time had been a constant presence in her young life. Despite this challenge, Zara approached each day with remarkable courage and curiosity, especially about the stars and planets that fascinated her. Her father, Dr. Malcolm Washington, was not just a devoted dad but also one of Atlanta's most respected pulmonologists. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him that despite his expertise in treating lung diseases, he couldn't cure his own daughter. After losing his wife Aisha to breast cancer 3 years earlier, Malcolm had been raising Zara alone, their bond strengthened through shared grief and resilience. "Dad, do you think I could still be an astronaut with CF?" Zara had asked one evening as they gazed at the stars from their backyard telescope. "The sky has never been a limit for determined souls," Malcolm had answered, his heart breaking a little at the question while simultaneously swelling with pride at her ambition. In recent months, Zara's condition had deteriorated significantly. Her oxygen saturation levels kept dropping, and Malcolm had been forced to obtain a portable oxygen concentrator, POC, for her daily use. The device, though small, was essential for maintaining proper oxygen levels in her bloodstream, especially during exertion or stress. The trip to Boston Children's Hospital represented their greatest hope. An experimental treatment pioneered by a research team there had shown promising results in early trials. When Malcolm received the call that Zara had been accepted into the treatment program, he'd spent days meticulously preparing for their journey. He knew the regulations by heart. Federal Aviation Administration rules clearly permitted the use of approved POCs during all phases of flight, including takeoff and landing. Malcolm had obtained all required documentation, a physician's statement, written by Zara's specialist, not himself, to avoid any conflict of interest, advance notification to the airline, and manufacturer specifications proving the device met all safety requirements. The night before their departure, Malcolm had reviewed the paperwork once more while Zara packed her backpack with astronomy books and her tablet filled with documentaries about space. "This time next week, we might be starting a whole new chapter," Malcolm told her as he tucked her into bed. "Will it hurt?" Zara asked, her brown eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "I won't lie to you, sunshine. Some parts might be uncomfortable, but I'll be with you every step. And if this treatment works, I can breathe better. Maybe even run without stopping," she finished, her smile illuminating the dimly lit room. "That's right. Boston is just the beginning." Neither of them could have imagined that their journey would face its greatest obstacle not from Zara's medical condition, but from something far more insidious and painful, the color of their skin. The Washington family arrived at Atlanta International Airport 3 hours before their scheduled departure. Malcolm had always been meticulous about preparation, but today's journey carried additional stakes. With Zara's portable oxygen concentrator and the need for accommodations, he wanted to ensure they had ample time to navigate security and boarding procedures. "You doing okay, sunshine?" Malcolm asked as he wheeled their carry-on luggage through the bustling terminal, Zara walking beside him with her small backpack adorned with NASA patches. "Just a little tired," she admitted, her breathing slightly labored despite the nasal cannula delivering supplemental oxygen. Malcolm had called the airline multiple times in the preceding week to confirm their arrangements. Special pre-boarding had been requested and approved to allow Zara to get settled comfortably before the main boarding rush. The airline representative had assured him that a note had been placed in their reservation regarding the medical equipment. When they reached Gate B-17, Malcolm approached the counter where a gate agent named Brian Miller greeted them with a warm smile. "Good morning. How can I help you folks today?" Brian asked, his eyes meeting Malcolm's directly. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Washington, and this is my daughter Zara. We have confirmed pre-boarding arrangements due to medical needs," Malcolm explained, presenting their boarding passes and medical documentation. Brian reviewed the information efficiently, nodding as he verified the details in the computer system. "Yes, I see the note here. Everything looks in order, Dr. Washington. We'll begin pre-boarding in about 20 minutes, and I'll make an announcement for you specifically." "Thank you, I appreciate that," Malcolm replied, relieved at the straightforward interaction. When pre-boarding was called, Malcolm and Zara approached the gate. Brian smiled at them again, scanned their boarding passes, and wished them a pleasant flight. The initial part of their journey was proceeding exactly as planned. That changed the moment they stepped onto the jetway. A flight attendant with a tight blonde bun and a name tag reading Heather Donovan intercepted them before they reached the aircraft door. Her eyes immediately fixed on the portable oxygen concentrator hanging from Zara's shoulder. "Excuse me, what is that device?" Heather asked, her tone sharp and suspicious rather than inquisitive. "This is an FAA-approved portable oxygen concentrator," Malcolm explained calmly. "We have all the required documentation. The airline was notified in advance." Heather's eyes narrowed as she extended her hand. "I'll need to see that documentation." Malcolm retrieved the folder from his briefcase and presented the physician's statement, manufacturer specifications, and airline notification confirmation. Heather scrutinized each page with visible skepticism, flipping through them quickly as if searching for discrepancies. Behind them, other passengers had begun to enter the jetway. A white family with 2 children passed by with a cursory nod from Heather, who didn't interrupt her examination of the Washington's paperwork to check their boarding passes. "This physician's statement doesn't specify which flights it's valid for," Heather said, pointing to the document. "It doesn't need to," Malcolm replied, maintaining his professional demeanor despite his growing unease. FAA regulations require a physician's statement indicating the passenger's ability to travel and need for oxygen. There's no requirement for flight-specific documentation. Heather's mouth tightened. "Are you claiming to know airline regulations better than I do, sir?" Malcolm took a measured breath. "Not at all. I'm simply stating what the FAA requires for travelers with portable oxygen concentrators. As you can see from the documentation, we've met all requirements." Zara squeezed her father's hand, her discomfort evident both from the physical strain of standing in the jetway and the tension of the interaction. After several more uncomfortable moments, Heather reluctantly handed back the folder. "Fine. But I'll need to verify this with the captain before takeoff." As they finally moved past her toward the aircraft door, Malcolm overheard Heather whisper to another flight attendant, "Keep an eye on them. Something doesn't seem right." The word stung, but Malcolm focused on getting Zara settled into their seats. They had chosen first-class accommodations not for luxury but for the additional space and comfort essential for managing Zara's medical equipment and ensuring she could rest properly during the flight. As they buckled their seatbelts, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that their journey had just become substantially more complicated, not because of Zara's medical needs, but because of something far more persistent and pernicious in American society. Once seated in first class, Malcolm helped Zara get comfortable, adjusting her portable oxygen concentrator and ensuring the nasal cannula was properly positioned. The spacious first-class cabin provided the room they needed, with Zara by the window where she could watch the takeoff and landing that she always found fascinating despite her medical challenges. "You good, sunshine?" Malcolm asked, his voice low and soothing. Zara nodded, her eyes bright with excitement despite the stressful boarding experience. "I can see the wing from here. Did you know that the curved shape creates different air pressure above and below, which generates lift?" Malcolm smiled at his science-loving daughter. "I did know that. Someone's been watching her aerospace documentaries again." As the rest of the passengers boarded, Malcolm noticed Heather Donovan making frequent passes through the first-class cabin, her gaze lingering on Zara's oxygen equipment each time. Her suspicion was palpable, creating an undercurrent of tension that Malcolm tried to shield from his daughter. Another flight attendant, a black man whose name tag read James Reynolds, approached them with a genuine smile. "Can I get either of you something to drink before takeoff?" "Maybe some apple juice?" he asked, directing the question to Zara. "Yes, please," Zara replied shyly. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, thank you," Malcolm responded, grateful for the normal interaction. When James returned with their drinks, he leaned in slightly. "That's a ResMed Eclipse, right? My mother uses the same model. Very reliable." Malcolm nodded, appreciating the flight attendant's knowledge and implicit support. The plane pushed back from the gate and taxied to the runway without incident. As they reached cruising altitude, Malcolm began to hope that perhaps Heather's initial suspicion had been satisfied and they could enjoy an uneventful flight to Boston. This hope was shattered about 45 minutes into the flight when Zara's oxygen saturation monitor began to beep softly. Malcolm checked the reading and saw that her levels had dropped to 89%, not immediately dangerous but requiring adjustment. "I need to increase your flow rate a bit, okay?" he told Zara, reaching for the device. As his fingers touched the dial, Heather appeared beside them with startling speed. "Sir! What are you doing with that equipment?" she demanded loudly, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "I'm adjusting the oxygen flow rate. My daughter's saturation levels have dropped slightly," Malcolm explained calmly, continuing the routine adjustment. Heather's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Stop! You cannot perform unauthorized medical procedures on this aircraft." Zara's eyes widened with alarm as Malcolm gently but firmly removed Heather's hand from his wrist. "This is not a medical procedure. It's a standard adjustment that my daughter makes several times daily, similar to how someone might adjust their insulin pump or hearing aid. I wasn't informed of any adjustments that would be made mid-flight," Heather insisted, her voice rising. "This could interfere with aircraft systems. The documentation we provided clearly states that the device is FAA approved for all phases of flight," Malcolm countered, his patience wearing thin as Zara's anxiety visibly increased. Her breathing was becoming more labored, exactly what he needed to prevent by adjusting the oxygen flow. James appeared in the aisle, sensing the escalating situation. "Is everything okay here?" Before Malcolm could respond, Heather turned to her colleague. "This man is manipulating unauthorized medical equipment. I believe it poses a safety risk to the aircraft." "It's a standard portable oxygen concentrator," James replied, his professional tone masking his obvious discomfort with Heather's characterization. "Nevertheless, I need to confiscate it until we can verify its safety," Heather declared, reaching toward the device now attached to Zara's seat. "Absolutely not," Malcolm stated firmly. "This device is keeping my daughter's blood oxygen at safe levels. Removing it would cause her immediate respiratory distress." Ignoring his warning, Heather grabbed the portable oxygen concentrator, attempting to disconnect it from Zara's cannula. Zara let out a frightened cry as the tube pulled against her nose. "Stop it! You're hurting me!" Zara screamed, tears springing to her eyes. Malcolm's paternal instincts surged. He placed his hand over Heather's, preventing her from taking the device while carefully ensuring he used only enough force to protect his daughter, not to threaten the flight attendant. "Take your hands off me immediately!" Heather shouted. "This is assault!" The first-class cabin erupted in a mix of confused murmurs and outright protests. Several passengers had begun recording the incident on their phones. An elderly white woman across the aisle gasped audibly, while a young Asian couple in the row behind them exchanged worried glances. "He's not assaulting anyone," called out a passenger from row 4. "He's protecting his daughter's medical equipment." James attempted to defuse the situation. "Heather, this device is permitted. I've seen the documentation myself." "That's not for you to determine," Heather snapped at him before addressing the cabin at large. "Everyone remain in your seats. This situation is under control." She then leaned closer to Malcolm, her voice lower but intensity undiminished. "If you don't release this device immediately, I will have security remove you from this aircraft when we land." Malcolm's heart pounded as he found himself in an impossible position, defending his daughter's right to breathe while being painted as aggressive and dangerous simply for doing so. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him that the very action of protecting his black child's life was being weaponized against him, transformed into a threat narrative that had ended too many black lives before. "My daughter cannot breathe without this device," Malcolm stated, his voice level despite his rising fear and anger. "I am a physician, and I am telling you that removing this device is medically dangerous." The overhead speaker crackled to life with the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a situation in the cabin, we will be returning to Atlanta. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." As the plane banked into a turn, Zara began to cry softly, her breathing becoming more labored with each passing moment of stress and conflict. Malcolm met James's eyes, silently pleading for reason to prevail. James nodded almost imperceptibly before disappearing toward the cockpit, while Heather stood triumphantly in the aisle, arms crossed, watching the Washingtons as if they were dangerous criminals rather than a father and his medically fragile daughter. "This is your captain speaking. We're beginning our descent back to Atlanta International Airport. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival." The announcement sent waves of frustration through the passengers, many of whom had important connections or appointments in Boston. The cabin filled with murmurs and the occasional outburst of annoyance. Through it all, Malcolm Washington remained focused solely on his daughter's deteriorating condition. Zara's oxygen saturation had dropped to 87% following the confrontation with Heather. The portable oxygen concentrator that had been the center of this unnecessary drama was still functioning, but the stress of the situation had affected Zara's breathing pattern, making the supplemental oxygen less effective. "Deep breaths, sunshine," Malcolm coached, keeping his voice steady despite the anger and fear churning inside him. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." Heather Donovan had stationed herself at the front of the cabin, occasionally announcing to nearby passengers that the situation was under control, despite the evidence of a distressed child struggling to breathe normally. She had already radioed ahead for security to meet the plane, describing a belligerent passenger interfering with crew member duties. From across the aisle, a middle-aged white woman named Karen Mitchell loudly supported Heather's version of events. "I saw the whole thing. He grabbed her arm. We don't know what that machine really does. It could be anything." An elderly Asian couple, the Chens, sat quietly in the row behind the Washingtons, Mr. Chen discreetly recording the unfolding scene on his phone. Mrs. Chen, a retired nurse, watched Zara with professional concern, noting the girl's labored breathing and the frightening pallor developing beneath her brown skin. James Reynolds had disappeared into the cockpit briefly after the confrontation, ostensibly to brief the captain. When he returned, he knelt beside Zara's seat under the pretense of checking her seatbelt. "Dr. Washington," he whispered, "I've informed the captain of the medical necessity of the device. He's requesting medical credentials when we land." Malcolm nodded gratefully. At least someone on this flight was behaving reasonably. As the plane descended, Zara's condition worsened. Her lips had taken on a slightly bluish tinge that sent alarms blaring through Malcolm's medical mind. He reached for her emergency inhaler in his carry-on, an action that immediately drew Heather's attention. "Stop. Don't remove anything else from your bag," she commanded, rushing down the aisle. "My daughter is in respiratory distress." "I'm getting her rescue medication," Malcolm replied, his doctor's training helping him maintain composure despite the absurdity of having to justify providing emergency medical care to his own child. "How do we know that's what it really is?" Karen Mitchell chimed in from across the aisle. "It could be anything." The plane touched down with a jolt that sent Zara into a coughing fit. Malcolm supported her shoulders as she struggled to catch her breath, the inhaler ready in his hand. James appeared with a cup of water, genuine concern on his face. "Security will be boarding first," Heather announced to the cabin as the plane taxied to the gate. "All passengers remain seated." The minutes that followed were excruciating. Zara's breathing had stabilized somewhat after using the inhaler, but her oxygen levels remained dangerously low. Malcolm continued monitoring her vitals with the practiced efficiency of a physician while simultaneously preparing himself for the confrontation he knew was coming. Do you think Heather was justified in her actions, or was this a clear case of racial profiling? Comment number 1 if you believe medical necessities should always take priority over an airline employee's suspicions. Hit that like button if you're shocked by how quickly this situation escalated. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice prevailing against discrimination. What would you have done if you were another passenger witnessing this unfold? And what do you think will happen when security boards the plane? Let's find out in the next part of this incredible true story. The aircraft door opened to reveal 3 airport security officers, their hands resting near their holstered weapons. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered white man with a crew cut, stepped into the cabin with an air of authority. "Where's the situation?" he asked Heather, who immediately pointed toward Malcolm and Zara. "This passenger became combative when I questioned the use of an unauthorized device," Heather explained, loud enough for everyone in the first-class cabin to hear. "He physically prevented me from performing my safety duties." Malcolm remained seated beside Zara, one hand holding hers, the other ready to present the documentation he'd already shown multiple times. The security officers approached cautiously, as if expecting resistance. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and step into the aisle," the lead officer instructed. "My daughter is in respiratory distress," Malcolm replied calmly. "I'm a physician. Dr. Malcolm Washington, Chief of Pulmonology at Grady Memorial Hospital. I cannot leave her side at this moment." He handed over his medical credentials along with the FAA documentation for Zara's portable oxygen concentrator. The second security officer, a black man whose name badge read Jackson Thompson, took the documents and reviewed them with careful attention. "Officer Thompson," Malcolm continued, maintaining professional composure, "my daughter has cystic fibrosis and requires continuous oxygen support. Her current saturation is 85%, which is approaching a critical level. I can't step away from her." Officer Thompson glanced at Zara, noting her labored breathing and the pulse oximeter on her finger displaying the concerning number. His expression shifted subtly. "The device has been properly documented and approved for air travel," Malcolm added. "The airline was notified well in advance." Heather pushed forward. "That's not the issue. He became physically aggressive when I attempted to inspect the device for safety concerns. I prevented her from disconnecting my daughter's oxygen supply," Malcolm corrected. "At no point did I act aggressively toward Ms. Donovan." From the row behind them, Mrs. Chen spoke up in accented but clear English. "The flight attendant tried to take away the little girl's breathing machine. The father only protected his child. We have video." Mr. Chen held up his phone, indicating the recording. Several other passengers nodded in agreement, some holding up their own phones. "My husband did not assault anyone," a confident female voice stated from a few rows back. A white woman in her 40s stood up. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Hayes, thoracic surgeon at Mass General. I witnessed the entire interaction. That child needs immediate medical attention, not interrogation." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. What had begun as one flight attendant's suspicion had escalated into a public showdown with multiple witnesses contradicting the official narrative. Captain Gregory Peters emerged from the cockpit, his face stern as he surveyed the scene. "What's the status here?" Officer Thompson handed the captain Malcolm's documentation. "The passenger has proper medical credentials and documentation for the oxygen device, Captain." Captain Peters reviewed the paperwork quickly before his eyes settled on Zara. His expression changed instantly from administrative concern to alarm. "This child needs medical assistance immediately," he stated, all other considerations suddenly secondary. "Dispatch, this is Captain Peters from Flight 1852. We need emergency medical response to Gate B17 for a pediatric respiratory patient, Priority 1. The cabin fell silent as the reality of the situation finally took precedence over the manufactured crisis. Malcolm continued monitoring Zara's oxygen levels, which had dropped to 83% despite the supplemental oxygen, a genuinely dangerous level. Heather stood awkwardly by the galley, her earlier certainty visibly faltering as medical concerns overrode her security allegations. "I was just following protocol for unidentified electronic devices," she muttered, though few were listening anymore. "All passengers will remain seated while medical personnel board," Captain Peters announced. "Once they've assessed the situation, we'll proceed with deplaning." Malcolm faced a critical decision. His instinct as a father and physician was to focus exclusively on Zara's medical needs, yet he knew that without addressing the false accusations against him, this situation could recur or worse, become another statistic in the ongoing pattern of criminalizing black parenthood. "Captain," he said firmly, "once my daughter is stable, I want to file a formal complaint regarding this incident. What happened today was not about airline safety. It was about bias, plain and simple." Captain Peters nodded solemnly. "I understand, Doctor. Let's take care of your daughter first. The rest will be addressed, I assure you." Airport medical responders arrived within minutes, bringing with them additional oxygen equipment and monitoring devices. As they worked efficiently to stabilize Zara, the reality of what had transpired became increasingly clear to everyone on board. What should have been a routine flight had turned into a dangerous medical emergency, not because of any action Malcolm had taken, but because a flight attendant had decided that a black man and his daughter with their medical equipment warranted suspicion, regardless of documentation or expertise. The other passengers began deplaning, many stopping to offer words of support or outrage on the Washington's behalf. Karen Mitchell slipped out without making eye contact with anyone, while the Chens made sure to provide their contact information in case Malcolm needed witnesses later. As the medical team prepared to transport Zara to the terminal for further assessment, Malcolm caught Officer Thompson's eye. "This isn't the first time," Thompson said quietly. "Won't be the last either, unless something changes." Malcolm nodded, understanding the unspoken solidarity. "Then let's make sure something changes." The airport medical response team worked efficiently, setting up a temporary treatment area in a private room near the gate. 2 paramedics and an emergency physician monitored Zara's vital signs while administering supplemental oxygen through a more powerful system than her portable concentrator. Malcolm stood at Zara's side, his medical training and paternal instincts perfectly aligned as he assisted the team. Her baseline oxygen saturation typically runs around 94% with supplemental support, he explained to Dr. Rivera, the emergency physician. "She's been stable at that level for the past 6 months. We're getting her back up to 90% now," Dr. Rivera confirmed, adjusting the flow rate. "What exactly happened on that plane?" Before Malcolm could answer, the door opened, and Heather Donovan entered alongside a man in a business suit wearing an airline management badge. Her demeanor had shifted from authoritative to defensive, but she continued pressing her version of events. "As I've explained to Mr. Anderson, I was simply following security protocols for unidentified electronic devices," Heather insisted. The passenger became confrontational when questioned. Philip Anderson, whose badge identified him as customer service manager, looked uncomfortable as his eyes moved between Heather and the medical scene before him. "My daughter's portable oxygen concentrator was fully documented and approved," Malcolm stated firmly, not looking up from Zara's monitoring equipment. "The airline was notified well in advance. Ms. Donovan attempted to remove medical equipment that my daughter requires to breathe. There was nothing unidentified about it." Anderson cleared his throat. "Dr. Washington, on behalf of the airline, I want to express our deepest." He was interrupted by his ringing phone. After checking the screen, his expression changed to one of alarm. "Excuse me, I need to take this." As Anderson stepped outside, Dr. Rivera continued working to stabilize Zara. "Her numbers are improving, but she's experienced significant stress. I'd recommend continued monitoring before she travels again." Malcolm nodded, the reality sinking in that their carefully planned trip to Boston Children's Hospital would now be delayed. The experimental treatment Zara had been accepted for required her to be in stable condition upon arrival. This incident had not only been discriminatory and dangerous, it had potentially delayed life-changing medical care. The door opened again, and James Reynolds entered, still in his flight attendant uniform but without his official name badge. His decision to remove it spoke volumes about the unofficial nature of his visit. "Dr. Washington," he said quietly, "I wanted to check on Zara's condition." "She's stabilizing," Malcolm replied, grateful for the flight attendant's genuine concern. James hesitated before continuing. "I've provided my statement to management about what happened. You should know this isn't the first incident involving Heather. There have been patterns, particularly with minority passengers." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I suspected as much. Videos from at least 6 passengers are already circulating on social media," James added, showing Malcolm his phone screen where #FlyingWhileBlack was trending. One clip showed Heather attempting to take the oxygen concentrator while Zara cried out in distress. Another captured Malcolm calmly explaining the medical necessity of the device while Heather accused him of being aggressive. The door burst open again as Philip Anderson returned, his face ashen. "Dr. Washington, our CEO Rebecca Carter is on her way here personally. The videos have gone viral. We're convening an emergency board meeting via video conference." Heather's face paled. "Videos? What videos?" "Multiple passengers recorded the incident," Anderson explained tersely. "Including your attempt to remove medical equipment from a child in respiratory distress after her father repeatedly explained its necessity." The dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a single flight attendant's unchecked authority had transformed into a corporate crisis with the potential for significant reputational and legal consequences. Malcolm's phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Dr. Washington speaking." "Dr. Washington, this is Imani Jackson with the Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund. We've been contacted by several concerned citizens who witnessed today's incident on your flight. I'd like to discuss legal representation if you're interested." Malcolm glanced at Zara, now resting more comfortably as her oxygen levels stabilized around 92%. The medical emergency was resolving, but the larger issues remained. "I appreciate your call, Ms. Jackson. I'll be in touch once my daughter is stable." As he ended the call, Anderson approached again, visibly nervous. "Dr. Washington, we've placed Ms. Donovan on administrative leave pending investigation. The airline would like to issue a formal apology and discuss compensation for your distress and inconvenience." "My priority is my daughter's medical treatment in Boston," Malcolm replied firmly. "She was scheduled to begin an experimental therapy for cystic fibrosis tomorrow morning. We'll arrange private transportation as soon as she's cleared to travel," Anderson promised. Outside the door, a commotion of voices and camera equipment announced the arrival of media representatives. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. Malcolm sat beside Zara's treatment bed, holding her small hand in his. The immediate danger had passed, but the incident had exposed something Malcolm had always known but had tried to shield Zara from for as long as possible, that in America, even a black child's right to breathe could be questioned by those with power, regardless of documentation, credentials, or medical necessity. "Dad?" Zara whispered through her oxygen mask. "Are we still going to Boston?" Malcolm squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, sunshine. We're going to Boston. And things are going to change, not just for us, but hopefully for others too." Outside, the voices grew louder as the story continued to unfold across social media platforms, news outlets, and increasingly, within the airline's executive offices where emergency response protocols were being activated not for a security threat, but for a threat to the company's reputation and financial standing. The turning point had arrived, not just for Flight 1852, but potentially for airline policies regarding medical equipment, staff training, and the too often ignored reality of how bias affects even the most vulnerable passengers. Rebecca Carter, CEO of Atlantic Airways, strode through the airport terminal with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to managing crises. At 52, she had navigated the airline through financial turbulence, industry consolidation, and a global pandemic. But the viral videos of a flight attendant attempting to remove a black child's oxygen device presented a uniquely damaging scenario, one where every minute without an appropriate response compounded the damage. Current social media metrics, she asked the communications director walking briskly beside her. Over 3 million views across platforms. Celebrity shares from at least 6 major influencers with social justice backgrounds. Mainstream media has picked it up. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox are all covering it from different angles. And the Washingtons? The girl has been stabilized. They're in a private room near Gate B17. Legal is concerned about potential civil rights violations, not just negligence. Carter nodded grimly as they approached the door. Her board meeting via video conference had been unambiguous. This situation represented not just a PR disaster but a fundamental failure of training in corporate culture that demanded immediate and transparent action. Inside the room, the atmosphere had grown increasingly tense. Hospital transport had arrived to transfer Zara to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta for overnight monitoring. Malcolm was gathering their belongings when Carter entered. "Dr. Washington," she began, extending her hand. "I'm Rebecca Carter, CEO of Atlantic Airways. On behalf of our entire company, I want to express my profound apology for what you and your daughter experienced today." Malcolm regarded her carefully before accepting the handshake. "My concern is making sure my daughter receives the medical treatment she was scheduled for in Boston." "Of course," Carter nodded. "We've arranged for a private medical transport to fly you both to Boston as soon as Zara's doctors clear her for travel. All expenses covered, naturally." As they spoke, Malcolm's phone continued buzzing with notifications. The video had been shared by several of his medical colleagues, including the chief of surgery at Grady Memorial. Local civil rights organizations were issuing statements. His sister had texted that CNN had requested an interview. "Ms. Carter," Malcolm said, his voice measured but firm, "what happened today wasn't a service failure or a misunderstanding. Your employee attempted to remove life-supporting medical equipment from my daughter despite clear documentation and my medical expertise. I have to ask, would this have happened if we were white?" Carter didn't flinch at the direct question. "I can't speak to Ms. Donovan's internal biases, but I can tell you that her actions violated our policies and training. She has been terminated, effective immediately." "Terminating one employee doesn't address systemic issues," Malcolm replied. "How many other families have faced similar treatment without the benefit of videos going viral?" Before Carter could respond, Philip Anderson entered with a tablet. "Ms. Carter, the initial statement has been drafted for your approval." Carter reviewed the screen, frowning slightly. "This won't work. It's too defensive. Rewrite it with a clear acknowledgement of what happened and concrete steps we're taking." She handed the tablet back and turned to Malcolm. "Dr. Washington, I'd value your input on how we should address this situation." "I'm not interested in helping your company with damage control," Malcolm stated plainly. "I'm interested in ensuring that no other family experiences what we did today." Carter nodded. "That's precisely why I'm asking. Whatever financial settlement our legal team proposes, and they will propose one, won't address the underlying issues. I'd like to discuss meaningful changes to our policies, training, and culture." Their conversation was interrupted as a nurse entered to check Zara's vitals before transport. Malcolm turned his full attention to his daughter, the corporate crisis momentarily secondary to his role as father and physician. Outside the room, the story continued to unfold across multiple fronts. James Reynolds had been interviewed by airport authorities about previous incidents involving Heather Donovan. His testimony revealed a pattern of security concerns that disproportionately targeted passengers of color, particularly those with medical devices or special needs. On social media, the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack had expanded to include hundreds of other stories from black travelers who had faced similar suspicion, from questioning of medical equipment to outright removal from flights for non-compliance, when they had simply advocated for themselves or their children. The airline's initial statement, posted without Carter's approval, had attempted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding regarding equipment verification procedures. The backlash was immediate and severe, with medical professionals and disability advocates joining civil rights organizations in condemning both the incident and the inadequate response. When Malcolm rejoined the conversation after ensuring Zara was comfortable for transport, Carter was on the phone with her board chairman. "Yes, I understand the shareholder concerns, but a formulaic response will only make this worse," she was saying. "We need to own this failure completely." She ended the call and turned to Malcolm. "Our legal team has advised me not to admit fault publicly. I'm overruling them. What happened to your daughter was wrong, and it reflects failures at multiple levels of our organization." Malcolm studied her, looking for the corporate calculation behind the apparent candor. "What specifically do you propose to change?" "For starters, a complete overhaul of our medical accommodation training. Second, an independent audit of our policies and their implementation regarding passengers with disabilities and medical needs. Third, a formal partnership with civil rights organizations to address potential bias in our customer service practices." "Those all sound like steps in the right direction," Malcolm acknowledged. "But they'll only matter if they're implemented with genuine commitment rather than as a temporary PR strategy." Carter nodded. "I understand your skepticism, Dr. Washington. That's why I'd like to offer you a role in overseeing these changes, not as an employee, but as an independent consultant with full access to our training programs and the authority to recommend binding modifications." The offer surprised Malcolm. It wasn't the defensive posturing or attempt at financial settlement he had expected. Before he could respond, his phone rang again, Imani Jackson from the Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund calling for an update. As Malcolm spoke with the attorney, outlining the airline's response thus far, he watched Zara being prepared for transport. The incident had been traumatic, but his daughter's resilience continued to amaze him. Despite everything, she had asked if she could still become an astronaut someday. "Of course you can, sunshine," he had told her. "Today just proves how strong you are." When he ended the call, Carter was waiting patiently. "Ms. Jackson suggests that any agreement include provisions for systemic monitoring and regular public reporting on implementation," Malcolm informed her. "I believe we can accommodate that," Carter replied. "Our commitment needs to be demonstrable, not just declarative." As they continued discussing terms, Malcolm realized that the corporate response had evolved from damage control to something potentially more substantive. Whether driven by genuine remorse, business necessity, or some combination of both, the airline was being forced to confront issues that had likely festered unaddressed for years. The medical transport team arrived to move Zara to the waiting aircraft that would fly them to Boston once she was cleared for travel. As Malcolm prepared to accompany his daughter, he turned to Carter one last time. "My focus right now is getting Zara to her treatment in Boston. But when that's secured, I'll be expecting those systemic changes we discussed, not just for us, but for every family that deserves to travel with dignity regardless of their medical needs or the color of their skin." Carter nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Dr. Washington. This will not be merely a crisis response. It will be a turning point for our airline." Whether that promise would translate into meaningful change remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: what had begun as one flight attendant's discriminatory actions had escalated into a moment of potential transformation, not just for Atlantic Airways, but for how the airline industry as a whole addressed the intersection of race, disability, and medical necessity. 3 days after the incident that had gone viral across social media platforms and news outlets, Zara Washington lay in a hospital bed at Boston Children's Hospital, her condition finally stabilized enough to begin the experimental treatment that had brought them to Boston in the first place. The walls of her room were covered with colorful drawings from her classmates back in Atlanta and printouts of supportive messages that had flooded Malcolm's social media accounts. Malcolm sat beside her bed, reviewing the treatment protocol with Dr. Eliza Chen, the lead researcher for the clinical trial. Despite the exhaustion etched on his face, Malcolm's focus was sharp as they discussed the potential benefits and risks of the gene therapy designed to address the underlying cause of cystic fibrosis rather than just its symptoms. Based on her current condition, I believe Zara remains an excellent candidate for the treatment, Dr. Chen assured him. The respiratory episode on the flight hasn't compromised her eligibility. Malcolm nodded, relief evident in his expression. That's the best news I've heard all week. A gentle knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Rebecca Carter stood in the doorway, no longer flanked by public relations staff or legal advisors. I hope I'm not intruding, she said. I wanted to check on Zara personally and update you on the changes we've begun implementing. Malcolm gestured for her to enter. Over the past 3 days, their interaction had evolved from crisis management to something approaching a genuine partnership for change. While Malcolm remained appropriately skeptical of corporate promises, Carter's actions thus far had demonstrated an unusual level of commitment. Zara, this is Ms. Carter. She's the CEO of the airline, Malcolm explained. Zara looked up from her tablet where she'd been watching a documentary about the International Space Station. Are you the one who fired that mean flight attendant? She asked directly. Carter nodded, taking a seat on the other side of the bed. Yes, I am. And I'm making sure that what happened to you never happens to another child. Good, Zara replied simply before returning to her documentary. Malcolm couldn't help but smile at his daughter's straightforward assessment. The treatment begins tomorrow morning, he told Carter. Dr. Chen believes Zara's prognosis is excellent. I'm very glad to hear that, Carter said. The private medical transport will remain available for your return journey whenever Zara is cleared to travel home. She opened her briefcase and removed several documents. As promised, I wanted to update you on our progress. Heather Donovan's termination has been processed, and we've discovered this wasn't her first incident involving minority passengers with medical devices. There were 2 previously filed complaints that were inadequately addressed by management. I'm not surprised, Malcolm commented. James Reynolds mentioned there had been patterns. James has been offered a promotion to our newly created position of Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator for in-flight services, Carter continued. He initially declined, concerned it might be perceived as tokenism, but after reviewing the scope of authority the position carries, he's accepted. Malcolm nodded approvingly. He deserves the recognition. His intervention may have saved Zara from a much worse outcome. Carter handed Malcolm a folder containing a comprehensive outline of policy changes already being implemented. Our board has unanimously approved a complete overhaul of our training programs related to passengers with medical needs. We're partnering with 3 disability rights organizations and 2 civil rights groups to develop new protocols. The changes were substantial: mandatory quarterly training for all customer-facing staff on medical accommodation requirements, a new medical liaison position at major hubs to assist passengers with health concerns, revised escalation procedures that required medical professionals to be consulted before any action affecting medical equipment, and perhaps most significantly, an independent review board that would assess all complaints related to discrimination or medical accommodation failures. We're also establishing the Washington Medical Transport Fund, Carter added. It's a $5 million initial commitment to assist families with travel expenses related to seeking specialized medical treatment. Malcolm reviewed the documents carefully. The corporate response had gone far beyond the typical damage control and token gestures he had initially expected. Whether motivated by genuine remorse, business necessity, or the glaring spotlight of public scrutiny, the changes represented meaningful progress. These are substantive steps, he acknowledged. The real test will be in their consistent implementation over time. Which is why we need your continued involvement, Carter responded. As we discussed, your role as independent consultant gives you oversight authority and direct access to our board's compliance committee. Their conversation was interrupted by a news alert on Malcolm's phone. The Department of Transportation had announced a formal investigation into discrimination complaints against multiple airlines, citing the Washington incident as a catalyst for broader scrutiny of industry practices. It seems the impact extends beyond Atlantic Airways, Malcolm observed, showing Carter the alert. She nodded. As it should. This isn't just about one incident or one airline. It's about recognizing that these isolated incidents form patterns that reveal systemic problems. As they continued discussing implementation timelines, Malcolm felt the complex emotions that had characterized the past 3 days. There was still anger at what Zara had endured, skepticism about long-term corporate commitment, and exhaustion from managing both a medical crisis and unexpected public attention. But alongside these, something new had emerged, a cautious hope that Zara's traumatic experience might catalyze changes benefiting countless other families. Later that evening, after Carter had departed and Zara had fallen asleep, Malcolm stood at the hospital window overlooking Boston's illuminated skyline. His phone contained dozens of messages from other Black parents sharing similar experiences, medical colleagues offering support, and advocacy organizations requesting his partnership. The incident had thrust him into an unexpected role as spokesperson for an issue that intersected his identities as a Black man, a physician, and a father of a child with a disability. It wasn't a role he had sought, but as he watched Zara sleeping peacefully, oxygen flowing freely through her cannula, he recognized it was one he couldn't decline. The resolution had begun, not just for their traumatic flight experience, but potentially for the broader patterns of discrimination that made such experiences all too common. Whether that resolution would fulfill its promise remained to be seen, but the mechanisms for accountability were now in place, and Malcolm Washington had no intention of allowing them to falter. 6 months later, Malcolm and Zara Washington stood in the jetway of Gate C-12 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Zara's portable oxygen concentrator hung comfortably from her shoulder, the nasal cannula delivering supplemental oxygen that had become less necessary since her successful experimental treatment in Boston. "Ready for takeoff, astronaut?" Malcolm asked, squeezing his daughter's hand. Zara nodded, her expression a mixture of excitement and lingering apprehension. This would be their first commercial flight since the incident that had changed not only their lives but airline policies nationwide. The gate agent, wearing a newly designed pin indicating specialized training in medical accommodation procedures, smiled as she scanned their boarding passes. "Dr. Washington and Miss Zara, we're honored to have you with us today. Captain Peters is looking forward to saying hello once you're on board." Malcolm nodded in recognition. Captain Gregory Peters, who had been commanding the flight 6 months ago, had since become the head of Atlantic Airways' newly established Accessibility Services division. The airline had made good on its promises, implementing comprehensive reforms that were now being adopted as industry standards. As they stepped onto the aircraft, they were greeted by a flight attendant who introduced herself as Letitia Williams. "Your medical accommodation has been noted in our system, and all crew members have been briefed," she assured them. "If you need any adjustments to your oxygen during the flight, please don't hesitate to let us know." The difference from their previous experience was striking. Rather than suspicion and hostility, they were met with informed professionalism and respect for Zara's medical needs. Once settled in their first-class seats, Malcolm reflected on the extraordinary journey they had undertaken since that fateful flight. The Washington Medical Transport Fund had already assisted over 300 families with travel expenses for specialized medical treatment. The airline's mandatory training program on medical accommodations and bias recognition, which Malcolm had helped develop, was being implemented across multiple carriers. Even more meaningful was Zara's remarkable progress. The experimental gene therapy had produced results that exceeded even the researchers' expectations. Her lung function had improved to nearly 85% of normal capacity, a dramatic change that had transformed her daily life. While she still required supplemental oxygen during exertion or stress, her doctors were optimistic that she might eventually need it only during sleep. Captain Peters emerged from the cockpit to personally welcome them on board. "Dr. Washington, Miss Zara, it's good to see you both under better circumstances." "Much better," Malcolm agreed, shaking the captain's hand. "Thank you for your support during that difficult day." "I'm just grateful some good has come from it," Peters replied. "Your advocacy has changed how we approach medical accommodations industry-wide." As they spoke, Malcolm noticed a familiar face among the security team conducting a routine pre-flight check. Officer Jackson Thompson, who had recognized the racial dynamics at play during the original incident, had transitioned from airport security to the airline's new accessibility team. Thompson gave Malcolm a subtle nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of how far things had come. The most profound changes, however, were visible in Zara herself. Beyond her improved physical health, she had discovered a new purpose in sharing her story. With Malcolm's support, she had spoken to her school about living with cystic fibrosis and the importance of standing up against discrimination. Her presentation had been so compelling that she'd been invited to address a medical conference on pediatric respiratory care, where her first-hand account of the intersection between medical necessity and racial bias had moved healthcare providers to examine their own practices. Perhaps most significantly, NASA had reached out after learning of Zara's story and her passion for astronomy. They had invited her to join a specialized program for medically complex children interested in space science, even arranging a video call with a current astronaut who had overcome serious childhood health challenges. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Zara adjusted her oxygen flow with the casual confidence of someone who had learned to advocate for her own needs. "Dad," she whispered, "do you think all this would have happened if that flight attendant hadn't been so mean?" Malcolm considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, sunshine, the worst moments can lead to the best changes, but only if we refuse to let injustice stand. You didn't just survive that day, you helped change things for other kids who might have faced the same treatment." Zara nodded thoughtfully as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. As they lifted into the sky, Malcolm watched his daughter gazing out the window at the clouds, her eyes filled with the wonder that had always defined her, despite every challenge she'd faced. The experimental treatment had given Zara a new lease on physical health, but the aftermath of the discrimination they'd encountered had given her something equally valuable, a voice that people listened to, and the knowledge that her experiences mattered enough to change systems that had failed for too long. For Malcolm, the journey had reinforced what he had always known, that the world remained an uneven playing field for children who looked like his daughter, especially those with medical vulnerabilities. But it had also shown him the power of turning trauma into transformation, not just for themselves, but for countless others who would never know Zara's name but would benefit from the doors her experience had opened. As they soared above the clouds, Zara's oxygen flowing freely, her future brighter than it had ever been, Malcolm felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since that day 6 months ago. They had traveled through discrimination, danger, and injustice to arrive at a place where their story had become part of something larger than themselves, a small but significant shift in how society treated its most vulnerable members. "Look, Dad," Zara said, pointing out the window. "We're above the clouds now." "Yes," Malcolm agreed, seeing both the literal clouds below and the metaphorical obstacles they had risen above. "And the view is pretty amazing from up here." Zara's smile illuminated the cabin as the plane continued its ascent, carrying them forward into a future they had helped reshape, not just for themselves, but for all those who would follow in their path. This story reveals how systemic discrimination affects even life-or-death situations for Black Americans. When implicit bias overrides medical necessity, it exposes the ongoing struggle for equal treatment in everyday spaces. Malcolm and Zara's experience demonstrates that advocacy matters. One incident, properly documented and amplified, can spark institutional change. By refusing to accept a mere apology and demanding structural reform, Malcolm transformed his family's trauma into protection for others. The story also highlights the power of allies like James, Officer Thompson, and the passengers who recorded evidence. Their willingness to speak truth to power made all the difference. For medical professionals, it's a reminder that credentials don't shield Black professionals from prejudice, but expertise can become a powerful tool for systemic reform. Most importantly, Zara teaches us resilience isn't just about surviving injustice, it's about using your voice to ensure others won't face the same barriers. Even a child can become a catalyst for meaningful change when supported by community advocacy and institutional accountability. What bias have you witnessed or experienced in everyday situations? How would you respond if you saw discrimination happening to another person? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for joining me in these important conversations about justice and humanity. Remember, your voice matters in creating the equitable world we all deserve.